You would never go to an architect and agree to build a house if they just gave you a Word doc. Products in the same way are...
You have had so much of experience. You've been at multiple companies. How has all of this experience shaped your approach to product leadership?
Two things have really helped. One is Reforge tends to be very focused on framework-based thinking.
What do you think about some of the companies also going for all the title inflation now?
Yeah, it's funny because I've seen both. I think it ultimately comes down to...
Ravi Mehta is a product executive and entrepreneur. He was the co-founder and CEO of Outpace, a company that is reinventing the way that people learn and grow. He was the chief product officer at Tinder, a product director at Facebook focused on Gen Z engagement, and the head of consumer product at TripAdvisor.
You have to kind of take in your strength and lead with your strengths as well in your career.
Absolutely.
So when you think about scaling consumer tech, what advice would you offer somebody who's in that domain?
When you win big. You win bigger than any other space, but it's really hard. There's a set of things that I think can help.
Hello, welcome to the Priyanka Shinde Podcast, where we dive into the art and science of strategy, execution, and leadership. I'm your host, Priyanka Shinde, author of The Art of Strategic Execution and a consultant for tech leaders. In this podcast, I bring you candid conversations with top executives, startup founders, and industry experts who are driving innovation, delivering results, and staying ahead in today's competitive landscape. We will break down what it takes to tap into founder mode and turn vision into action. If you are serious about elevating your leadership and execution skills, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. It helps the podcast and ensures you never miss an episode. Hi everyone, welcome to the Priyanka Shinde Podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Ravi Mehta. He is a senior product executive with experience leading product organizations for globally recognized brands like TripAdvisor, Facebook, and Tinder. Over his career, Ravi has scaled well-known products that have impacted millions of people and scaled teams to meet the challenge. Ravi is a well-respected thought leader, and his frameworks on product strategy and product leadership have been adopted by thousands of professionals across the industry. Even I have leveraged one of his frameworks. Most recently, Ravi was the founder and CEO of Outpace, where he launched first of its kind AI professional coach using the latest advances in generative AI technology. Previously, he was the chief product officer at Tinder, a product director at Facebook, VP of consumer product at TripAdvisor, and an executive in residence at Reforge. Ravi is an active advisor and investor primarily focused on consumer tech companies. Very excited for this conversation, Ravi. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited as well.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit more about what you're focused on currently and how has your journey been so far?
Yeah, so for the last year and a half, 2 years, I've been working with companies to help them accelerate their product strategy and build out their product teams. I'll often work on a fractional or interim basis. Over the last year, I've been working with a company called Sesame Health, which is a direct-to-patient consumer marketplace for healthcare. So patients can come to Sesame and pay completely out of pocket an upfront cash price to get healthcare. So very different than trying to go through the insurance system where people need to have insurance. Insurance can be very expensive. Then you're not sure how much you're going to have to pay out of pocket. So that's been really rewarding. We've had a great year in terms of building out the business, moving to more recurring revenue, launching our mobile experience. I've also worked with a number of other companies that are in the early product market fit seed stage. And so really enjoying what I've been doing. I spent most of my career at bigger companies, helping them build out their product teams. And now I get to do that for lots of different companies at various different stages. So it's been really rewarding.
That's wonderful. You're kind of going across different industries and working with multiple companies. So not really, that this is one area only. And so how do you manage to think about all of these diverse set of domains? Because sometimes, especially when we think of in product terms, the domain expertise is definitely an advantage. And so you can build upon it, but you're also transitioning or working with multiple industries or domains at a time. So tell us a little bit more about how that is. Is that challenging or any insights there?
I think for me, the primary challenge is really context switching, is moving from one thing to another and just being able to do that really well. In terms of working in lots of different domains, I've actually found it's very helpful. There's often really interesting ideas if you can take an idea or a concept from one domain and apply it to another. For example, with Sesame, it is a healthcare company, but a lot of the people at the company have consumer technology DNA because we're looking for people to bring in a very consumer first mindset to an industry that hasn't been very focused on the consumer. And as a result, rethink some of the old ideas, the old ways of working, which could be a lot better if you take a technology first and a consumer first approach. I first sort of learned about this or really got the value of this when I was at TripAdvisor, and we were thinking through how do we improve the search and discovery on TripAdvisor. And one of the things that we did is we thought about how can we make it easier to find the hotels or the restaurants or attractions that you're looking for directly on the site. We started by looking at other travel companies like Booking or Expedia or Kayak, and we didn't get that far. It was kind of hard to see where we could go from where we were today to something that was innovative and worked much better for customers. And actually what we found were the best examples of search and discovery were completely outside the travel domain. So companies like Amazon and Spotify enable you to search within a really broad range of millions of different offerings. They have to provide recommendations that are hyper targeted. They have to guide a user through the process of, either playing a song, which is a relatively low lift thing, or buying a product, which is much higher lift. And so we got a lot of inspiration by looking completely outside of the domain and thinking about how can we improve search and discovery on TripAdvisor through that. And since then, I've really had an appreciation for looking at different products in different domains and cross-pollinating the ideas between those as a way to come up with a different way of thinking about the user and potentially a novel way to solve something.
I really like that because the cross-pollination is so important. It's almost like kind of think outside the box or think outside your norms that you might have within a particular industry. So I think that's a really great insight and a tip for anybody sort of thinking about making their products better.
Absolutely. I think it's a great thing for, especially newer PMs to look at all of their products that they're using and ask, how do these products that seem unrelated actually tie back to the thing that I'm trying to build?
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned that you have been working with large companies, and then now you're working with smaller companies, advising, investing, or working in a fractional manner. What is, was there a moment where you made this decision in your career journey of thinking about going from established companies to smaller startups and smaller establishments?
I made the transition a couple of times in my career. So I started my career at Microsoft. I was there for about 6 years. And then I went to business school. And directly after business school, I joined a seed stage startup. So I went to a very different stage, did that for a number of years, and then went to TripAdvisor, then Facebook, then Tinder. So I had a period of my career that was more on the big company side. And now for the last 4 or 5 years, it's been focused more on startups and fast-growing companies as well, scale-ups as well. And so I've actually enjoyed both immensely. I think that there is something really fulfilling about working on a product that's a household name that millions of people are going to use and get benefit from. It's very rewarding to work on a feature that then a friend or a family member gets to get value from. But I also love the fast speed and the impact that you can have at smaller companies. And so now I get to dabble in both. I work with some larger companies as well as smaller companies, and it's nice because it helps me sort of cross-train across different elements. There's a way of working at a small company, which I think a lot of people are talking about now, which goes to, everybody should be a builder or the ideas behind founder mode that I think are very powerful. Like when you are willing to roll up your sleeves and get into the dirt and really help build and learn about the technology underlying the product, that's powerful whether or not you're at a multinational corporation or at something that is at the seed stage. So I think one of the advantages and opportunities of being a product manager and a product leader is you get to have optionality in your career and you get to pick where you want to focus. For me, it's really been around consumer and social tech, and you get to pick where you want to play the field. And for me, it's been at different stages of that.
Makes sense. Yeah, definitely. I think every company has its own stage, and then depending on where you might be in your career stage, you might enjoy one more at a certain
Absolutely.
point. And so I think that's what you're sharing, is like you can go back and forth between these, and at the same time I'm sure it's not necessarily like a cakewalk either. So was it ever like, what was challenging about sometimes making these transitions, and what helped you through that you can share with others?
I think what is true is there's lots of optionality within the product career, but it's also important to use that optionality wisely. Generally, I think if you are making a career move, if you move from something that is in your domain to something else that is in your domain, you get the benefit of upward momentum. And so there's a certain amount of momentum or velocity that benefits you. But if you want to move laterally to a different domain, you have to choose to move laterally rather than move upwards. And so I think that combination of, do I want to go laterally and explore something new? Do I want to really invest and become more senior in an area is a trade-off that people need to make and think about what are their career goals. Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook had a really good analogy, which is, a career is not really a ladder. It's more of a jungle gym. And it's really about kind of figuring out where do you want to flex yourself? What's your next path? Sometimes you're moving up and up and up. Sometimes you're moving more laterally and wanting to explore new things. And for me, the last 4 years of being closer to startups has really been about, I've managed large teams. I'm really enjoying getting back to smaller teams, building faster. I've spent a lot of time focused on AI over the last year and a half as well. And so, that's been something that I might not have had the opportunity to do if I was in a large organization and was working on an established product that didn't necessarily have a clear strategy around AI. For me, I've been able to say, this is something I'm incredibly excited about in terms of the raw potential of the technology. And I've invested a lot of time over the last couple of years learning about it, helping companies think about it, and working on AI-powered products.
Yeah. That's really great. And I really like what you mentioned about, one is, do you move in the same domain and then have that upward momentum? And if you move to a different domain, have the move laterally, because I think what you're saying is that you have to kind of take in your strength and lead with your strengths as well in your career.
Absolutely.
And this reminds me of like this pivot triangle that I often talk about, which is like, if you are pivoting somewhere, like you don't want to pivot on all three corners of the triangle. Otherwise, you're kind of left with nothing. And it's really hard. And especially now where, the job market is tough, leading with your strengths. And, even if it's a lateral move, sometimes lateral moves aren't considered like the best, like the most, successful parts of it. But you really are trying to go in with knowing and with your strengths so that you are more successful wherever you go. So I really kind of like that. And I wanted to just emphasize that a little bit more. That also, like you talked about Sheryl Sandberg and what she mentioned about, careers being a jungle gym. What is one best piece of advice and one worst piece of advice that you have received over the years in your career?
I think one of the best pieces of advice was to not think about the trouble with any one role is you sort of build a reputation at a company, and then when you move on to the next role, oftentimes you're building from scratch. And hopefully your career is sort of compounding in a way that it's enabling you to take on roles of increasing responsibility. But some of the best advice that I got was think about like what is the connective tissue between those roles and build a personal brand around that. And by doing that, that enables you to have a profile that is independent from, in addition to, your role in any one particular organization. Because rather than being known as the chief product officer at Tinder or a VP at TripAdvisor. Instead, I've spent some time over the last few years building up a brand, and people know me as someone who's thoughtful about product leadership and product strategy, irrespective of any one role. And I think that's really helped me develop this career where I've been able to work with lots of different companies and do something that I really enjoy. So that's one of the best pieces of advice that I've gotten. And that's something that I build, that I tell anyone who's looking for a new role, is think about your personal brand and how to get that brand online. That doesn't mean that you have to start a Substack. That doesn't mean that you need to write every week in a newsletter. But it does mean that you should think about what are the things that you are uniquely an expert in and create a little bit of content around those. Create some articles on LinkedIn or create a website. Every single designer has to have a portfolio in order to be considered for roles. every engineer has to have a GitHub repo or a set of repos that are essentially the front door to their experience. It's the same for product folks. If you can point people to some work that you've done, it can be thought leadership in a particular area. It can be case studies on products that you've built. That gives you such a leg up when you are interviewing for a role. That means that your profile for that role is no longer just the one page that's on your resume, but all of the really good work that you've done and the package that you've presented it in. And so that's, I think, the best piece of career advice that I've gotten is build a personal brand, not necessarily because you want to start a newsletter or do something like that, but because your thought leadership is valuable for you. It helps you codify the ideas that have been really important for you. And then it shows off how you think and what you can do in a much richer way than a LinkedIn profile or a resume could ever do.
Yeah, I really like that. I think it's so important. And something that, we talked about earlier in your introduction is you've developed these frameworks that are now leveraged by other people. And that's because of your thought leadership and your ability to build that brand. And I also feel that when you're writing all of these, when you're trying to put this material out there, sometimes in the context of a company, you do it in a very specific way. But when you do it on your own as your brand, it really strengthens not just your brand, but your communication skills, especially written skills, because a lot of times writing we don't write as much as we might have in many years ago. And so this is a great way to also just continue to build that skill up. And I feel like communication, writing, these are like important skills irrespective of where you might go.
Absolutely. And it helps you take the insights that you're gleaning and think about, how do I extrapolate that to something that is useful, not just for me at this company in this role right now, but something that I can rely on as an idea or a way of working, whatever I do in the future. And then for the really important ideas, those are things others are going to find valuable as well. And that's great. It's nice to be able to pay it forward. It's also really nice to be able to build some thought leadership around an area.
Yeah, like your impact goes beyond your company. It affects so many more.
Absolutely.
A worst piece of advice you can think of?
Worst piece of advice? I think the worst piece of advice is around titles and thinking that you should only make a move if the title increases. I've kind of seen over my career that titles are important and they are a signifier of how much scale you've had in your career. They're also a sign that you are a strong performer and that you're continually moving up. At the same time, the way one company defines a VP is very different than the way another company defines it. That discounting of titles is something that's happening more and more. Companies, as they evaluate you, are looking to understand, how many people did you manage if you were a manager? What was the scope of product that you had oversight over? How important was it to the business? What business impact did you make? And so I think focusing too much on title can be bad advice. There are cases where it makes sense. You always want to advocate for yourself and land in a role that you feel is commensurate with what you can deliver to that role. At the same time, don't turn down a great opportunity just because the title isn't what you want it to be, because being in a fast growing company where people are looking to you to help grow the business, where you're sort of on the rocket ship and you have the ability to help drive it forward, that is going to vastly outweigh going from a senior director to a VP when you change roles.
Yeah. Makes sense. What do you think about some of the companies also going for all the title inflation now? I've seen even jobs at Microsoft that are now called senior director or director, but they are essentially like a level 6 or IC6 roles.
Yeah, it's funny because I've seen both, right? You've got the inflation of titles, and then you've also got the massive deflation of titles. Companies like Facebook and others have said you have to be really, really senior to be at a director level or a VP level. I think it ultimately comes down to, what is the scope of the role? What are the skills that you need? And how are you deploying those skills? Broadly, I think that there's kind of 3 different tiers within the product team within an organization. There's the IC tier, there's the manager tier, and the executive tier. And the way that I like to differentiate those is, as an IC, your job is to build the product. As a manager, your job is to build the team that builds the product. And as an executive, your job is to build the systems that build the teams that build the product. And so that sort of escalation in terms of scope and responsibility is really the best indicator of whether or not you're in an executive role or you're in a manager role or you're in an IC role. And when companies have someone who's in sort of a super IC role, but give them a VP title, that's not really a service to the company. And it's not really a service to the individual as well, because then they need to justify their title when they're looking at their next role. I think too often titles are seen as a reward. It's like a cheap reward that a company can give because you don't have to give equity, you don't have to give additional comp or bonus. But the problem is that title is actually not a form of recognition. It is an organizational design tool. And really thoughtful companies think about, how do I want to define the strata in our organization so that the organizational design is really aligned with our strategy and what we're trying to accomplish? And when you waste titles as a reward, you no longer have that tool to design the org. And so, for that reason, I think it's important for companies to think about title as, in that way, as an organizational tool, not as a reward. And for individuals who definitely want to move up in their career, to understand that that's the situation that companies are in, and to seek out companies that are going to give you the opportunity to be a manager, to be an executive, rather than just the title.
Makes sense. Yeah, that was really helpful. Switching gears a little bit, you have had so much of experience. You've been at multiple companies and even been an executive in residence at Reforge. How has all of this experience shaped your approach to product leadership and strategy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I've loved my time at Reforge. I'm continuing to work with Reforge. I'm working with Brian Balfour, who's the CEO of Reforge right now, on a new course around AI strategy that's launching in April. Super excited for that. I think two things have really, really helped. One is Reforge tends to be very focused on framework-based thinking, not because frameworks are the answer, but because frameworks help you define the set of questions that are important to getting to a good answer. And so that's been really helpful to me as a product leader, is to think about, what are the tools that I can deploy in this particular situation to help get us to a really good answer. So for example, I've been in multiple situations, both before I worked with Reforge as well as now and recently over the last couple of years, where there'll just be sort of a gap in vision and strategy, where we'll kind of know roughly where we want to go, what success looks like, but not have a clear enough plan that it's executable. And so in that case, I've used some tools from Reforge as well as from other places to put together a very structured process to go from gaps in strategy to a really well-defined strategy that is clear, that is rational, and that the rest of the organization can build fluency around once it's been determined. So that focus on using really good tools, approaching things in a thoughtful, structured way is something that I've taken away from Reforge. The other thing is, Reforge is a great place where people go to level up. If you enroll in a Reforge course, or you're looking at the content, or using any of the other tools, you're there because you want to be better at your job. And I think what's great about almost every product manager and product leader I've worked with is that they're really ambitious. They want to grow. And so now as a product leader, I think a lot more about the people on my team and what their growth trajectory is and how I can enable that. Because I feel like if I do a really good job with that, they're going to naturally grow into the role. They're going to deliver really good work, and they're going to have a more fulfilling career at the company. In addition, one of the things I'm proudest of is I've hired a lot of product managers and product leaders over my career, many of whom had their first product management job. A lot of those folks today are directors and VPs at different organizations. And so if you can help a person not only be successful in their current job, but build a really strong product career, that's going to be something that's rewarding for you as a leader. It's also going to help you generate a really high performance team.
That's really awesome. I think you kind of covered a lot of things around not just like what a product manager can utilize, but also like helping others and building these teams. And so in your experience building product teams, like what have been some of like the most memorable moments that you can think about where either the team delivered on something really, really critical that seemed like, might not happen, or like turning a bold idea into something with like really tangible results that had a very specific outcome for people. Anything you can share over there?
I think one of the things I'm most proud of is over the last year of working with Sesame, we've been very focused on launching their first mobile app. The company is about 6 years old. It did not have a mobile application until recently. We launched it at the end of last year. And so, sorry for my dog in the background. So it was pretty rare for a company to be, as far in its journey as Sesame is, and to not have a mobile app. Yet at the same time, about 75% of people were using the product on mobile web. So there's a really clear need for people to have a better mobile experience. And so our remit as an org was, and as a small organization of about 40 people, our remit was, we need to build a mobile app, but we can't have it take up all of the resources. We need to have some vertical slice of the product that's been built over the 6 years be represented in the application. At the same time, we have other priorities that we need to work on. And the team did just a fantastic job of ideating what the mobile application should do, doing a great 0 to 1 design, thinking about what success looks like. One of our hypotheses was that people who use the mobile app will book more frequently and will have higher retention. That has panned out. We launched the app at the end of last year. It's got a 4.9 star app rating. And I think it was a really good example of thinking from first principles, having a really strong North Star vision before you start, a really incredible engineering team that did a great job of building it, focusing a lot on quality, focusing a lot on the specific use cases that we wanted to solve for, and launching something that we were really, really proud of. And so, a lot of times I think with product now, there's this temptation to just want to move incredibly fast, get an MVP out there, see what you can ship in 2 or 4 weeks. Instead, we spent several months on the mobile app and said, we want to ship something that represents a North Star vision rather than something that's quick and dirty, because we know that this will be a key part of our strategy moving forward. And so it was a really good example of taking a very different approach to product, not the MVP approach, but much more of a North Star full-fledged approach that I think worked out well.
Yeah, I like that very much. It kind of leads me into my next question, which I was going to ask is, what are some of the unconventional strategies or ideas that you have found to be effective when either leading teams or executing on products or ideas that you have? So anything else you can share over there?
Yeah, I think 2 unconventional ideas. The first one, which I believe strongly, is that vision should be visual. And so most strategy docs don't include any sort of visuals. I think a product strategy doc is incomplete without at least 10 wireframes that show very concretely what will the product look like if you achieve this strategy. And the analogy I like to use is it's a little like building a house. You would never go to an architect and agree to build a house if they just gave you a Word doc describing the house that they're going to build. They have to put together a blueprint. You and the architect won't have a shared understanding of what is going to get built unless there's a blueprint that captures that shared understanding. And that's because buildings are a 3-dimensional medium. Products in the same way are a visual, 2-dimensional, sometimes 3-dimensional medium, and visuals are really important to get everyone on the same page. That doesn't mean you need to do full-fledged designs, just like an architect doesn't build a scale model of your house, they build a blueprint. You can get away with wireframes, and those wireframes will be incredibly powerful in terms of providing a concrete understanding of what's going to get built, why that's the thing that's getting built, what are the trade-offs that are embedded in that. And so that's this first unconventional idea. It's very different than how a lot of people approach strategy docs, but I've had a lot of success using this in multiple companies and making sure that at the very earliest stages of strategy, we're starting to think about design and visuals and wireframes as part of that.
You said 2.
Yeah,
that's
and the second one is, so I have a post called the product strategy stack, which talks about the 5 elements of product strategy, starting with company mission, then talking about company strategy, then product strategy is the connective tissue between what the company's trying to accomplish and what the product team is working on day to day. And then there's product roadmap, and finally product goals. And so in that, the most controversial idea is the fact that goals should come from your roadmap rather than your roadmap coming from your goals. And that's controversial because people say, look, you have to know what you're trying to achieve. And then once you know numerically, metrically what you're trying to achieve, then you can develop a roadmap, features, and initiatives to drive those metrics. Instead, I think we have to be really clear about what is the sequence of things that we want to build that enable our strategy. And then from there, we can use metrics as evidence that the things that we build are actually working well for the user. And so it's a different way of thinking about goals. Goals are the evidence, they're the outcome of our work rather than the thing that's driving our work. And the analogy I like to use there is if you are going on a road trip, you don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to drive 200 miles. You say, I want to go from Los Angeles to San Diego. And so you have a destination in mind. And then how many miles you've driven are just evidence of the progress that you've made towards that destination. And so the roadmap is really painting a picture of your destination, and the goals are the progress that you've made towards that.
Yeah, that's really, I'm sure, like convincing somebody of, thinking, like flipping that thinking around might not have been easy, but
no, not easy.
Yeah. And your analogy really helps it. And I like both of them. Like, so vision should be visual, and then goals after roadmap.
Yeah, absolutely.
You also have a lot of experience with consumer tech, right? So when you think about scaling consumer tech, like in today's fast-paced environment, like what do you think is most important, or what advice would you offer somebody who is in that domain itself, or when you're working and advising startups?
So scaling consumer tech is incredibly hard, and I think it's only gotten harder. And so this is one of the reasons I think VCs don't invest that much in consumer, is because every single swing is, a really risky bet. When you win big. You win bigger than any other space. But it's really hard to get traction. And so there's a set of things that I think can help. The first one is to be really clear about what success looks like for you as a consumer founder. There's an increasingly large number of consumer businesses that, VCs or the tech industry might pejoratively call lifestyle businesses, but are really interesting businesses that can be built without raising a lot of venture capital, and where you don't have the pressure of hitting some, massive market capitalization by the end of it. And so there are lots of different consumers, lots of niches, they have lots of needs. Consumers are more willing to pay than they ever have been. They're more willing to give products a try. But in order to succeed, that means focusing on a long tail and being comfortable with a different way of building your company that might be different from the typical venture-backed mindset. Even relatively successful consumer companies like BeReal, for example, will sometimes hit a point where they saturate. And a lot of times consumer companies will have a point where they peak and then they come down to a baseline, and the baseline can be a really healthy business. But if you're a venture-backed startup, having a peak and coming down to a baseline is a kiss of death. And so, at that point, you're no longer the hot company. It's hard to raise. Valuations are going down. It's just really hard. But if you're capitalizing your company in a different way, that can be a really great place to end up to build a thriving business on. The dating industry has known this for a long time. You can generate interesting, durable businesses in dating by focusing on a niche and not always saying, hey, we're going to create the next #1 dating platform. So I think that's the first thing. One is to encourage consumer founders to think about building their business in different ways, and to encourage them to consider bootstrapping or other forms of funding than venture. The second thing, I think, is to be really clear about what value you're creating for the consumer. Value, very broadly, I think, can be in one of two buckets. You can create utility value, meaning you're solving a problem for your customer, or you can create entertainment value, meaning you're creating a place that the customer wants to spend time. And that clarity about whether or not you're creating utility or entertainment is really important for consumer products, because it helps you understand the reason why customers want to use your product and the reason why they're going to retain over time. And then once you're clear about like what is the type of use case that you're solving for, then there's a whole question around like how do you build habits? Ultimately, for I think any product really, but specifically consumer products, the only metric that matters is retention. And so, if you are creating a utility-based product, retention is going to correlate with how often does a user have this need to get this job done. And when they have that need, how often do they come back to you? And so there's a whole set of things that you can do to drive retention. If on the other hand, you're trying to create a retentive entertainment experience, then you need to have things that are constantly novel for a person to want to come back to. This is why Netflix is continuing to add content. This is why game companies are continuing to add more games to their portfolio. And so, based on the type of product that you're building, you can understand the way to approach retention broadly in those two areas. And then there's also some sub things to think about, like, is this a frequent habit forming use case, in which case it's easier to actually build retention? Or is this an infrequent use case that comes up every once in a while, like doing your taxes and buying a house, in which case you need to be very clear about what are your mechanisms for re-engagement. And so whether you're building an infrequent use product or a frequent use product, the strategies around retention are all the same, but ultimately the goal is the same. We need to get a person to come back. And that is the thing that will matter more than anything with consumer, because it's expensive to acquire the customer. It's hard to have someone give your product a try. Once they've done that, you want to maximize the chance that they're going to come back.
Yeah, you touch upon several key things with consumer products. It is extremely difficult to get someone, an individual, to sort of pay money to you for your product. I mean, even when they are more willing to do it, often the cycle from them knowing about your product to them really paying and starting to use it is long. And then you're talking also about retention, like how do you continue to have them use and bring back? And so it's not just acquiring, it's then keeping them engaged, which can be really hard. And I find even in the, like this is a little bit different, but even in the world of, say, coaching and things like that, people pay for it and they want to be part of these group experiences, but then life takes over and then they don't come in. And so money is not necessarily enough motivation for someone as well. And you have also kind of delved in the whole coaching side of things a little bit. So and I guess it's also consumer. So I would love to learn a little bit more about what inspired you to found Outpace, and then how was that experience? What was the most rewarding aspects? What were the most challenging aspects of it?
Yeah, so in 2021, I started a company called Outpace, focused on democratizing access to professional coaching. It actually came from looking at, what are the most valuable things that people engage in. And one of the things that you'd hear from people who have had a coach is one of the most valuable relationships in my life is my relationship with my coach. It's something like 95% of people that have tried out coaching would recommend doing it again for themselves and would recommend their friends doing it as well. So it has these incredibly high customer satisfaction rates, but actually relatively low adoption. Not enough people get access to coaching, know about coaching, not enough people can afford coaching. And so we started the company with the goal of creating a productized marketplace for coaching, which would enable people to more easily find and engage with a coach. And then over time, we pivoted to focus more on AI-based coaching. And so we built one of the first kind of AI-based coaching platforms where you could come in and get professional coaching. Our initial target was product managers. And so we built out a set of coaching programs for product managers that combined content with AI-based coaching. We ended up winding down the company in 2023 for a handful of reasons. One was just the landscape was very different. It was hard to raise venture in 2023. That goes to my earlier point around consumer. There are the venture model requires a really significant watermark for success, and if you can't prove that you can hit that watermark of creating a 10 billion or 100 or 5 billion to 10 billion or 100 billion exit, it's really hard to raise venture. Venture firms want to be able to underwrite their fund with every single investment they make. And so I think that there's an interesting opportunity around coaching. It's probably not venture scale, though. We also found that we sort of picked some of the wrong problems to solve. Happy to go into it in more detail, and just didn't have the runway to sort of figure out how to get it really nailed in, given how we built the company. So unfortunately, we ended up winding it down. I still regard it as a really good experience. I learned a lot about startups, learned a lot about AI, playing with some of the early tools, and took away a lot in terms of lessons on kind of how to think about startups and how to think about finding product market fit that I've been able to carry forward.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure it's never easy to sunset a product or, wind down a startup? I'm sure, like, especially for product managers and startup founders, it's kind of like your baby. So,
Yeah, it absolutely is.
yeah, I mean, what you mentioned a couple of these reasons on why you did it, but nevertheless, it still might be challenging to do it. And so, any advice there that you might have for other startup founders or product managers who are looking into like their products and, when is the right time to sunset a product?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an extremely hard decision to make. In part because as product builders, we invest so much of ourselves into the product. We believe in the product, otherwise we wouldn't be working on it. You've got users that are actively using it and getting value, and you don't want to let them down. You don't want to let the team down. You don't want to let the investors down. And so there's all this momentum to kind of carry things forward. At the same time, especially early stage, finding product market fit is really hard. Not only do you need to find product market fit, but then you need to find a scalable and affordable growth model with strong unit economics. And so you have this kind of compounding layer cake of really almost impossible challenges that you need to solve. And I think it's important to take a step back and to evaluate the opportunity in terms of what's the best of your time, use of your time as a founder, or what's the best use of the team's time? What are the real, the likelihood that this could break out and start to be really successful? And then based on that, sometimes it makes sense to continue. We faced a really tough fundraising market through, we started fundraising end of 2022. And then beginning of 2023, we realized it was going to be really hard. We kept the company going until the end of 2023. I self-funded part of it. We wanted to continue to kind of turn the page and see whether or not there was an opportunity to get to some really strong unit economics or get a strong partnership deal or raise a small round. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it just felt like the headwinds were outweighing the tailwinds. And so decided to wind it down. Incredibly hard decision, but I ultimately think it was the right thing, both for us as founders as well as for the team. In some sense, it's bittersweet because I think now more than ever, there's a really strong opportunity around AI-based coaching and different ways of thinking about how to create products that leverage AI to help others level up. I'm excited about the space. I'm excited to see the things that people are building in it. And, a lot of times with startups, it's often right idea, wrong time. And I think we were in that boat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes you're too early for some ideas, which can happen a lot as well. This brings me to the point where you also are an investor. You advise startups. And so you kind of also looking at the same thing from a different perspective itself. And there has been, since 2022, we have seen Gen AI and all of the hype, some of it real, some of it really a hype. And then also you mentioned founder mode earlier, right? So as an investor, when you're investing in companies and startups, what are you looking for that tells you that this is the right company to invest in?
I think there's the cliche stuff. There's the team and the product and the size of the market and all of that. I invest kind of for two reasons. One, I've made investments just because I believe in the founder and I want to support the founder. So someone who is coming from a really interesting background, who has a different way of looking at things. Those are founders that I like to bet on. They may not look like the typical founder, but they often have sort of a way of seeing the world that can be really valuable. And so that's one reason why I invest. It's really a way to kind of support, founders who I think are looking at interesting opportunities, that are solving important customer problems, that are purposeful and mission driven. And then I think this, and you can make those investments, and sometimes with any investing, you have to be comfortable with the probabilities that are behind that. And so those are often kind of the riskier side of things, but things where it's a big swing and potentially a really big hit. Second thing is I look at companies that are going to work well with the venture funding ladder, where there's a really clear way to hit the revenue milestones that venture companies are going to look for in terms of, sort of being able to quickly hit strong growth milestones year after year, and then have a really interesting either exit or IPO potential. And I think those are the kind of two sides of making investments that are important to look at. One is just like the hard to define element of the founder and their idea, and the other is the ruthless pragmatics of what does this look like in terms of the potential financials involved in growing the company.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of decisions that you have to make as an investor as well, in terms of like, where do I put my money?
Absolutely.
And I'm sure that's a very challenging decision as well, right? Um,
And for me, investing is secondary. I think that's one thing I've learned about myself as well. I tend to be incredibly optimistic. I love every idea, and I think the best investors are very skeptical and can tear ideas apart. And so I do less investing now than I've done in the past, and I'm more focused on kind of what are the companies that I want to work with, that I want to help grow. Not by investing, but by providing advice and being part of the team.
Yeah, that's really great. I think, I mean, you're still having an impact, playing a role in helping shape some of these companies. As you look into the future, like, what are you most excited about?
I'm incredibly excited about AI. And I know that is somewhat cliche, but I do feel like I was always a little skeptical of crypto and blockchain, and felt like it was kind of a special purpose technology for a certain vertical slice of problems. AI is really different. I got into computers when I was young. I started programming when I was 9 years old. And I felt this kind of delight in terms of being able to dive in, to code something, to see it on the screen. I started a game company when I was in high school, and then did that in college. And there was a certain excitement that I had about technology then that I've always had. But I really felt that reignite when I started to get deep into AI tech and see the things that are possible. And so I do think with anything, especially Silicon Valley, can overhype things, right? There's a spectrum between, hey, this is the next crypto, to hey, this is so big that the world is going to end and we're under existential threat. I think the actual truth is somewhere in the middle. This is a fundamentally game-changing technology, just like the internet changed everything 20 years ago. I think AI is going to change everything in the next 10 years. It's going to be an incredibly exciting time to be a builder. It's also going to be a really challenging time to be a builder. One of the things that we talk about in the AI strategy course is past platform disruptions like mobile and internet were naturally disruptive. They created these huge white space opportunities for new companies to come in part because the big incumbent players couldn't take advantage of that technology right out of the gate. And so, if you were Adobe and you had Photoshop, you couldn't just get Photoshop working in a browser. That was something that required an entire retooling of the software and a rethink about how the product works. If you were Facebook, you couldn't just shrink down the Facebook experience and have it run on a phone. You had to rethink the Facebook experience in terms of what does it look like to be mobile native. AI is really different. AI is often an accelerating technology rather than a disruptive technology. And so a lot of incumbent players, Adobe, Microsoft, have come in and quickly added AI. And so the startup space, the opportunity to build new things, is much more competitive than before. So I think it's an incredibly exciting time. There's going to be a lot of new and novel and interesting products being built, but it's also a really challenging time. It's going to require strategic clarity and thoughtfulness in the way that past shifts didn't necessarily require that. And so I'm really excited about it. I think every day I'm amazed by what the technology is capable of. And I think we're just at the beginning of thinking about what are the user experiences that are going to be built with that technology.
Yeah, definitely. I think AI has done so much in the last couple of years, and it truly is like accelerating. I think that is a great choice of word, because I feel like even just me, myself working here, I feel like I can do so much more because AI is there. And if you extrapolate that out to things that are happening in tech or just around the world, there's so much more opportunity. So yeah, something definitely I'm excited about as well. To close it off, I wanted to share that Ravi does have a Substack, so you should definitely go check it out if you haven't, and we'll put the link in the description as well. And you mentioned a little bit like you're also focused on strategy, execution, and leadership, which is what is also at the tail end of this podcast name. So there's a question that I sometimes ask guests, which is, if I gave you $100 and to split between strategy, execution, and leadership in terms of thinking about how would a startup be successful, how would you allocate that money?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think my answer would probably be unlike a lot of folks. I think probably $10 in strategy, $10 in leadership, and $80 in execution. I think figuring out what is the right product to build is really a matter of understanding what the customer wants. And if you have a very deep understanding of that, things related to the strategy tend to fall out from it. And then leadership is really ultimately about, pulling together a fantastic team and then giving them the space to do their best work. And I think ultimately the best companies are made when it comes to execution, being able to take that strategy, take that vision of what the future looks like for a particular customer and create something that is, like a utility. It's something, it's a product that you can turn on, that you can rely on, that works really well. And a good example of this, I think, is, if you look back to the early days of music streaming, the two products that were vying to win were Spotify and Tidal. And Tidal had every strategic reason in the world to win. It had, famous founders. It had really great ties to the music industry. It had better quality sound. It had a lot of exclusive music. And yet Spotify won. And Spotify won because they out executed. Tidal would often, skip songs, or, songs would skip kind of in the middle, or it would take a long time to start playing, or it wouldn't work on a certain network. And so the strategy of Tidal was absolutely the right strategy, but the execution didn't really work as well as Spotify, where it might not have had all those strategic advantages, but it had a product that worked incredibly well, that they executed incredibly well. And ultimately, that's the product that people grew a habit around. And especially for consumer products, habits are hard to form, easy to break. And so your product has to be flawless for the customer. And that's where the execution really comes in.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That was really insightful. And this has been a great conversation. I always feel like time is less. So, but we got to end it somewhere. But thank you so much for coming and sharing all of the wonderful insights with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
If today's conversation sparked new ideas or challenged your perspective, I'd love to hear from you. I work with tech leaders and founders to tackle complex challenges, whether it's scaling teams, making high-stakes decisions, or turning ambitious ideas into reality. If that sounds like something you are navigating, let's connect. Reach out via my website, thepriyankashinde.com, or find me on LinkedIn.